Brother Clarke?
I'd like to begin by establishing some kind of a frame of reference. Exactly what are we talking about? And I think in order to do this, I'm going to try to dismiss the subject, then come back to it and deal with it. There is no such thing as a race. Nature created no races. Man created races, racial classifications, and he had his own reason for doing it. Now, who benefited from this artificial creation at first? Who benefits from it now? Now, let's look at the historical roots of this whole thing, and you're not going to understand it until you understand the implications, the far-reaching effects of the opening up of the so-called New World, Christopher Columbus and other thugs coming, suppressing the Indians, and finding a justification for this kind of thing. Let's look at Europe in the 15th and the 16th century, because racism has its roots in that second rise of Europe in the 15th and the 16th century. They had to justify what they were going to do to most of mankind. They were about to take over the whole world. Now, there's a myth about an argument about whether the world was round or flat. That's an old wives' tale. The European had gained enough knowledge and had enough guns, and he had been hungry enough within the body of Europe until he decided that he was going to go out and take the world, be it round or flat. Now, in order to understand the religious basis of racism, we have to go back to a papal bull that the Pope issued in 1455 in an argument between Portugal and Spain. He turned to them impatiently and said, "You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people." And it just so happens that most of the so-called infidels were non-European people, non-white people. Europe not only had its basis for racism, it had its basis for the slave trade, and this same basis would be good in the colonial system that followed. Racism was created to justify the slave trade, to justify the colonial system, and to justify the utter ruthlessness that had to go into the making of modern capitalism. I'd like to continue from Reverend Clarke's point and deal briefly with image, because image is the paramount factor in keeping racism alive. Now, exactly when did the Christian church become white, in as much as Christ is described in early literature as being swarthy and having hair like sheep's wool, and that's surely not a Caucasian's hair. The first image of the church, the first image of the Madonna was the black Madonnas, and these black Madonnas were very prevalent in the churches of Europe. Up until the 16th and the 17th century, there was no white Madonnas in the churches of Europe. And some of the churches of Europe to this very day have black Madonnas. All right. At what point did Christianity become all white? And at what point did Christ become a blonde, blue-eyed person that hangs in your churches, and with a haircut and a uniform, he'd probably be a good Nazi? All right. One thing the Jews seem to have forgotten is that the picture of Christ, as in present-day literature, is an insult to them, because there's nothing particularly Jewish about him, physically or otherwise. All right. Now, another thing we're going to have to look at seriously is that when the Europeans projected themselves out into the broader world, they not only colonized most of mankind, they colonized the teaching of history itself. And gradually, so many things black became white. Now look, let's deal with our own historical naivete. Until we deal with it, we're not going any place. Black people have no right to expect anything from this establishment, because it wasn't set up for them. They wasn't brought to this country to be given democracy. They was brought to this country to do some work, to labor and to obey. And once the machines made a whole lot of these jobs obsolete, it tended to make a whole lot of the people obsolete. Now, we keep worrying about the American promise and the American dream, and we forget it wasn't made to us. And the white man has not betrayed anything because he didn't promise us anything in the first place. Now, the role of institutions in a society is to reflect the power that controls that society. So we have American institutions arrayed against us, and we naively expect these institutions to reform themselves, because if they reform themselves, that's tantamount to presiding over their own demise. Let's go back to this value, and I think I don't think we've gone over it too well. We need to look at what kind of societies did black people come out of? What happened before this interference? Now, we came out of basic pluralistic societies, but we came out of sharing societies where nobody was very rich and nobody at all was poor. Now, an African in these societies would no more kill a deer and say, "This is mine," than he would fly, because he didn't think that way. He thought of all property as belonging to the total community. Now, we were brought into a society as slaves just at the time the concept of private property and capitalism was getting well underway with the backing of the church. Now, there is a clash between the values of, the best values of the society we came out of and the society that enslaved us. And too many of us are tied up with these values, the sacredness of private property. What is so sacred about private property? What is so sacred about one man taking upon himself more than he could use in a lifetime while people walking by this mountain of wealth starving? Nothing particularly sacred about this. And these things did not exist in these old societies until these old societies began to have internal differences, and the European came in, and the African naively permitted him to arbitrate an African family dispute, until we understand that up on site, the African invited the European for dinner. That's the first thing he did. The Indian invited the European for dinner. The Polynesians invited the European for dinner. Now, if you invite people for dinner, first place, you've got plenty dinner, and you have a society that is traditionally hospitable to strangers. The Indians invited Christopher Columbus for dinner, the first thing they did. All right, now let's look at what was happening inside of Christopher Columbus's mind, and we can go to his own diary for this. He said, "I wonder why they're so friendly. They'll be easier to conquer than I thought they would be. I wonder why they're bringing such small amounts of gold. I wonder where the mines are." His intentions were not good. It wasn't good then. The intentions are not good now. And the black man is still hung up with this dinner invitation, this kindness, with the thought that if you treat a person humanely, that he will act humanely toward you. Black people have not seen white people at all. That is why they can't deal with them.
I want to say one.